My wife handed me divorce papers at my own birthday party. She didn't know the guests were there for a different announcement. By the time Jabari realized what his wife had done, the transfer was already recorded. The attorney had left. The board had voted. His mother sat in the third row, silent for the first time in 11 years. Some men lose everything loudly. Jabari lost his quietly, in a room full of witnesses. There are moments in a man's life when the architecture of everything he believed about himself becomes visible all at once. Not because something new was built, but because something was finally removed, and what was underneath had been there the whole time. This is the story of one of those moments. A birthday party, a sealed envelope, and a woman who had spent 11 years building something so carefully, so precisely, that when the time came, there was nothing left to argue about. There was only paperwork, and the sound of a room going very, very still. Jabari Ashford was 42 years old the night his world reorganized itself around him. The venue, a private event space in Midtown Atlanta called Meridian Hall, was one that Ashford Capital Partners used regularly for client functions. The tables were dressed in deep navy and gold. There were flowers, there was a cake. There were 47 people in that room who believed they had come to celebrate a man at the height of his success. Some of them had driven 2 hours. Some of them had flown. None of them, except for 3, understood what they were actually there for. And by the end of the evening, every single one of them would. The narrator does not begin at the beginning of this story, because the beginning is not where the truth lives. The truth lives at the end, after the chairs have been folded and the glasses have been cleared, and a man in a very good suit is sitting alone at a head table, holding a folder that has dismantled 9 years of assumption in 40 pages. The truth lives in the stillness after the slap, in the face of a woman who didn't flinch, in the voice of a board chair who rose from her seat with the measured calm of someone who had done this before and would, if required, do it again. That is where this story begins, in the aftermath, in the wreckage that didn't look like wreckage, because it had been assembled too carefully to be anything other than inevitable. To understand what happened that evening, you have to understand who Jabari Ashford was before it. Not the version he presented to clients or to the church or to his mother's friends at Sunday dinner. The real version. The one built from early mornings and long commutes and a childhood in the Vine City neighborhood of Atlanta, where ambition was not celebrated so much as it was quietly expected of the oldest son. Jabari's father, Calvin, was a logistics supervisor for a regional freight company. He worked 6 days a week for 31 years without complaint. He wore the same 3 dress shirts to church in rotation, and he believed, deeply and without irony, that a man's word was worth more than any document ever written. He passed this belief to Jabari, the way fathers pass things they mean to be gifts. Jabari carried it accordingly. His mother, Celestine, was a different kind of institution. She ran the usher board at Greater Harvest Baptist with the precision of a military operation and the confidence of someone who had never once been wrong about anything. She was not a cruel woman, but she had decided very early in her life that the world was organized in a particular order and that her role within it was to maintain that order at all costs. Her son was first in that order. Everyone else was support staff. Jabari graduated from Morehouse in accounting, worked 6 years at a mid-size financial services firm, and then did the thing that separated him from most of the men he grew up with. He started something. At 33, with a second-hand desk and a client list that fit on a single sheet of paper, he opened Ashford Capital Partners, a boutique wealth management firm. Not flashy, not loud, just disciplined, careful, and consistent. By year 4, the firm was managing 7-figure institutional accounts and had earned a reputation in Atlanta's black professional community as the kind of firm you brought your real money to, not your show money. He met Imani Okafor at a church anniversary dinner when he was 35. She was seated 2 tables away, talking to no one in particular, and she had the bearing of a woman who didn't need a room to notice her in order to feel comfortable. She was a corporate contracts attorney with a practice built around business formation, equity structure, and what she called, plainly, the documents people sign without reading. She was precise in the way that people who have spent years watching other people make expensive mistakes tend to be precise. Not cold, just accurate. Their courtship was unhurried. Jabari was methodical by nature, and Imani did not push. They dated for 2 years before he proposed. They married the following spring at Greater Harvest Baptist, in a ceremony that Celestine organized with the same authority she brought to everything. Imani wore a dress she had chosen herself, against 3 separate suggestions from her future mother-in-law. The ceremony was beautiful. The reception was long, and at the end of it, Celestine pulled Jabari aside near the coat check and told him that Imani was a fine woman and that she hoped she understood what it meant to be an Ashford. Jabari told her that Imani understood everything just fine. He believed that when he said it. In the 2nd year of their marriage, Imani joined the firm. This was not a ceremonial arrangement. She did not sit behind a desk and attend meetings as a formality. She came in as the firm's internal legal architect. She restructured the operating agreement. She formalized the equity arrangement that Jabari had, until then, managed through a combination of verbal understanding and paperwork that had been drafted quickly and reviewed even more quickly. She filed the founding trust documents. She established the board of 3 that would govern the firm's major decisions, Jabari as chair, herself as the 2nd seat, and Yvonne Mensah, a longtime figure in Atlanta's black financial community and a deacon at Greater Harvest, as the 3rd. Jabari signed everything she put in front of him, not carelessly, but with the kind of confidence that comes from trusting someone completely. He understood the broad strokes of what he was signing, what he did not do, what he would later understand to be the single most significant oversight of his professional life, was read the founding trust documents closely enough to understand the specific clauses that Imani had drafted into them. The co-trustee succession clause, the founder control designation, the provision that governed what happened to operational authority in the event of a co-founder departure or dissolution of the marriage. These were not hidden. They were not buried in footnotes or obscured by language designed to confuse. They were simply there in plain text, in the document he signed on a Tuesday afternoon in their home office, while Imani sat across from him and answered his questions, and he asked fewer questions than he should have. The document was thorough, because she had made it thorough, and he trusted her to have made it correctly, because he trusted her. He was right to trust her. He just didn't understand what he was trusting her with. The firm grew. The accounts grew. Jabari's profile in the community grew along with them. He was featured in a regional business journal. He was asked to speak at Morehouse. He was appointed to a city financial advisory board. And through all of it, Imani worked beside him, drafting, reviewing, advising, structuring, and received from the outside world, and from his mother in particular, approximately none of the credit. Celestine came to Sunday dinners. She sat at the head of the table, as though the title had been assigned to her by some authority higher than the people who owned the house, and she spoke about Jabari's firm with a pride so specific and so exclusive that it left no room for anyone else's name. She called it Jabari's company. She talked about Jabari's vision. She spoke about Jabari's hard work in front of a woman who had restructured the entire legal foundation of that company and asked for nothing in return except to be included in what she had helped build. Imani heard all of it. She sat at those dinners with the composure of a woman who had made a decision very early, not to spend her energy correcting Celestine. Not because she was afraid of her, not because she didn't have the language, but because she understood, in a way that Celestine never would, that a woman who argues in the wrong room at the wrong time is a woman who loses the argument before it starts. Imani was not interested in losing anything. The drift began in year 6. That was when Darnell Page entered the picture. Darnell was from Jabari's college years, a man with charm in quantities that had never been matched by anything resembling discipline. He had spent the better part of his 30s, adjacent to opportunity. Always nearby when something was being built but never quite responsible for the building. He had the gift of making himself seem essential in rooms where no one had taken attendance. And he had, from the first time he met Celestine at a cookout Jabari hosted, her complete and unconditional approval. Jabari brought him on as a strategic consultant in the spring of that 6th year. There was no formal agreement drafted. There was no board approval sought or given. Imani noted both absences and said so. Once, in the direct and measured way she said most things. Jabari told her it wasn't necessary, that Darnell was just helping with a few introductions, that it was informal. It was not informal for long. Within 8 months, Darnell was attending client meetings. He was sitting in on internal planning sessions. He had developed opinions about the firm's direction that he shared freely and implemented nowhere, because implementation required the kind of sustained effort that Darnell had never sustained in his life. But he was present, he was visible, and he had Jabari's ear in a way that had never required a credential or a contract to establish. Imani watched this. She did not panic. She did not issue ultimatums. She filed the observation the way she filed most things, carefully, in a place where it would be available when she needed it. The firm anniversary dinner was held that fall at the church hall. It was a Thursday evening, September, warm enough that the side doors had been left open. There were 40 people in that room. Many of them were clients, some were community figures, some were church members who had watched the firm grow from a single-page client list to something real. Celestine gave a toast. She had asked to give a toast, and Jabari had said yes, and she stood at the front of the room in a cream blouse and her good pearls, and she thanked by name every person she believed had contributed to Jabari's success. She thanked Calvin's memory. She thanked Greater Harvest. She thanked God. She thanked 3 of Jabari's college professors by name from memory. She thanked Darnell Page, who had been involved for less than a year, for his vision and his friendship. She did not say Imani's name. Imani was seated at the same table. She heard the toast. She raised her glass with everyone else. She smiled at the right moments. And when the applause settled and Celestine returned to her seat, with the satisfaction of a woman who had said everything she intended to say, Imani set her glass down and turned to the conversation beside her, as though nothing of consequence had just occurred. Later that night, Jabari told her his mother hadn't meant any harm. He said it in the way men say things when they believe the saying of it closes the matter. Imani said, "I know," and she let him believe that closed it. But something had shifted, not dramatically, not visibly, the way a foundation shifts in the months before. Anyone notices a crack, slowly, deliberately, in ways that are too quiet to register until they are impossible to ignore. Imani had spent 6 years believing that consistency would be recognized, that work would speak, that patience was a strategy and not just a posture. The toast did not destroy that belief, but it clarified something she had been trying not to see clearly, that the room she was in had a ceiling, and it had been installed by people who had never once asked her permission. Shash began that fall to read the founding documents again. The professional erosion came in the months that followed, and it came the way most damage comes. Not in one large event, but in a series of small redirects that only added up to something undeniable when you laid them end to end. Darnell had begun to suggest, in the easy, offhand way he suggested everything, that Imani's involvement in client-facing decisions was creating friction. He used the word intimidating. He used it in conversations with Jabari. He never used it to Imani's face, because Darnell was smart enough to know that a direct confrontation with her would not go the way he wanted it to go. So he worked the perimeter. He planted the idea the way you plant something you intend to harvest later, casually, repeatedly, without urgency. Jabari began copying Darnell on email threads that had previously been shared only with Imani. He framed this, when asked, as keeping the team aligned. He began consulting Darnell on client strategy matters that had previously been decided between himself and Imani in their regular weekly meetings. He did not do these things out of malice. Jabari was not a malicious man. He was a man who had been raised to believe that the person with the loudest claim to authority was the person who held it, and Darnell was loud in ways that Imani had never needed to be. Then the contract redirect happened. The Hollingsworth Group was one of the firm's 4 anchor accounts. Imani had managed the relationship for 3 consecutive renewal cycles. She knew the principals personally. She had drafted the original engagement agreement and every amendment that followed. It was, in every measurable sense, her account to manage. In October, without a conversation, without a memo, without so much as an email flagged to her attention, the Hollingsworth renewal was sent to an outside legal firm for review. The instruction had come from Jabari. The outside firm had no prior relationship with the account and spent 6 weeks producing a review document that said, in more expensive language, exactly what Imani would have told them in 3 hours. She found out through the outside firm's billing invoice, which crossed her desk because she was still, technically, the firm's internal legal authority. She did not confront Jabari that evening. She did not send an email. She went home. She made dinner. She sat in her home office after the dishes were washed and the house was quiet, and she opened her laptop, and she pulled up the founding trust documents. Not for the first time. She had been returning to them, incrementally, since September. But that night she read them the way she read everything that mattered, slowly, completely, with a yellow legal pad beside her and a pen in her hand. She read the co-trustee clause. She read the founder succession provision. She read the board voting structure. She read the language she had drafted 7 years ago in the careful early days of the firm, when she had believed she was building something with a partner who would remain a partner. She put the pen down. She looked at the legal pad. She had written 2 words. She turned off the light and went to bed. Those 2 words were the name of a corporate attorney she had known for a decade and had never needed to call for herself. Reginald Osei. Reginald Osei kept an office on Peachtree Road in a building that smelled like leather and old carpet and the kind of quiet money that didn't announce itself. He had practiced corporate and family law for 30 years. He had the economy of a man who had heard every version of every story and had learned that the only thing that mattered, in the end, was what the documents said. He was not warm. He was not cold. He was precise in a way that Imani recognized and respected, because it was the same precision she brought to her own work. They met twice. The first meeting was a document review. Imani brought the founding trust, the operating agreement, and the equity register. Osei read them in the way lawyers read things, not linearly, but surgically, moving from clause to clause with the efficiency of a man looking for something specific. At the end of the first meeting, he set the papers down and looked at her and said that the documents were well constructed and that her position within them was as strong as any he had reviewed in recent memory. She said, "I wrote them." He said, "I know." The second meeting was structural. They reviewed the co-trustee succession clause in detail, the provision that, in the event of the dissolution of the marriage or a voluntary co-founder departure, transferred full operational authority to the remaining co-trustee. They reviewed the founder control designation, which gave her co-equal authority over any major operational decision. They reviewed the board voting structure, which required only a 2/3 majority, 2 of the 3 board seats, to pass a resolution. Osei confirmed everything she already understood. The documents were valid. The provisions were enforceable. The equity structure was sound. Her position was not contingent on Jabari's agreement, because the agreement had already been made 7 years ago, when he had signed a document she had drafted with this possibility, however distant, already accounted for. He asked her one question. When did she want to move? She told him the date. She told him the venue. She explained the guest list and why it mattered. She explained about Ivan Mensa and the board quorum. She explained about the notary she would need in attendance. She walked him through the sequence with the same methodical calm she brought to every complex matter she had ever managed. Osei made notes. He said he would coordinate the paperwork and the timing. He said the divorce petition would be filed in advance and sealed pending service of process, which she would handle personally at the venue on the evening of the event. She said, "Thank you." He said, "Don't thank me. This is your work." He was right. She had been working on it for 7 years without knowing it, and for the last several months with full and complete awareness. The petition was filed 11 days before Jabari's birthday party. The seal held. Jabari received no indication, no signal, no change in the atmosphere of the house or the marriage that would have told him anything was coming. Imani made dinner. She attended church. She answered emails. She was, to anyone watching, exactly what she had always been: composed, present, and entirely in control of whatever she had decided to be in control of, which, as it turned out, was everything. The invitations to the birthday party had been sent by Imani. This was not unusual. She had managed the firm's event coordination for years, and a milestone birthday for the founding partner was the kind of occasion that fell naturally within her domain. Jabari had been pleased. He had told Darnell about the party. He had told his mother, who had begun planning her outfit, the same afternoon. He had assumed, in the uncomplicated way that men assume things when the arrangements are being handled by someone they trust, that the evening had been organized for him. The guest list was specific. The 47 attendees included the firm's 3 largest account partners, 6 members of the firm's professional network, representatives from 2 institutional clients, church members who had known Jabari since childhood, family, and Yvonne Mensah, who had been the board's 3rd seat from the beginning and who had received, 10 days before the party, a board resolution document from Reginald Osei's office, along with a brief and entirely professional explanation of what was being asked of her and why. Yvonne Mensah had been a deacon, a financial advisor, and a board member long enough to have seen the full range of what people are capable of doing to each other when money and pride are involved. She read Osei's letter once. She reviewed the resolution document. She called Imani and asked one question: "Is the documentation sound?" Imani said yes. Yvonne said, "Then I'll be there." A notary public named Lawrence Tibbs had also been retained, listed on the evening's documentation as a professional guest. He arrived early. He sat near the back. He had a briefcase. Jabari arrived at the venue at 7 o'clock in a charcoal suit that Imani had selected for him 2 weeks prior, and laid out on the bed the evening before the party without comment. He was pleased and relaxed, and he moved through the room with the ease of a man who believed the space had been arranged in his honor. Celestine was already there, in the 3rd row of the venue's seated arrangement, in her best church clothes, radiating the specific energy of a woman who considered herself the 2nd most important person in any room her son occupied. Darnell was at the bar. Imani was at the head table, reviewing something on her phone with the focus of a woman who had one thing left to do and intended to do it correctly. The evening proceeded as evenings like this proceed: drinks, conversation, the warm noise of a room full of people who believe they are there for a pleasant reason. Jabari worked the room. He shook hands. He laughed. He accepted compliments about the firm and about the year and about his 42 years on this earth, with the graciousness of a man who felt, genuinely and completely, that this moment belonged to him. He was not wrong. The moment did belong to him, just not in the way he understood. Midway through the evening, before any formal remarks had been made, Imani stood from her seat. She crossed the room to the head table. She did not call for attention. She did not tap a glass or raise her voice or create any of the theater that the moment, had it been handled by a different kind of woman, might have included. She placed an envelope on the table in front of Jabari the way a person places a document in a business meeting, with intention, without decoration, without any expression on her face that could be described as anything other than composed. She returned to her seat. Jabari looked at the envelope. He looked across the room at her. She was already seated, looking at nothing in particular. He picked up the envelope. He opened it. He removed the papers inside and he read the first page with the careful attention of a man who understood what he was holding but was working very hard in real time to find an alternate interpretation. There was no alternate interpretation. The divorce petition, his name, her name, the firm's name, and attached to it, with a paperclip, the co-trustee succession clause from the founding trust documents, already executed and notarized, initiating the transfer of operational authority to Imani Ashford, co-founder and co-trustee of Ashford Capital Partners, effective upon the completion of board confirmation. He read it twice. He read it a third time. And then something moved in him. Something old and reflexive and entirely disconnected from the man he believed himself to be. And he stood up. He crossed the room toward her. The room noticed. The room went quiet the way rooms go quiet when they sense that something is happening that they do not yet have language for. He reached her. And what happened next, the narrator records without embellishment, because embellishment would dishonor the gravity of it. His hand connected with the side of her face. One motion, one sound. The sound a room makes when it stops breathing. Imani did not fall. She did not cry. She absorbed the impact the way a woman absorbs something she has, in some deep and private part of herself, been half expecting. She turned her face back toward him slowly. She looked at him with eyes that held no surprise and no anger and nothing that could be read as defeat. She said nothing. The narrator pauses here and holds the image. Because what Jabari had just done, in front of 47 witnesses, in a room with a notary and a board chair and 3 of the firm's most important account partners, was not merely an act of violence. It was the removal of every remaining argument he might have made, every procedural objection, every emotional appeal. In one reflexive moment, he had handed her the one thing the documents alone could not have given her, the complete and public confirmation of exactly who he was. Before Jabari could speak, before anyone in the room could find the right response, Yvonne Mensah stood up. She rose from her seat without drama, without urgency, with the unhurried authority of a woman who had been given a specific role to play and intended to play it correctly. She adjusted her jacket. She looked out at the room, and she introduced herself, not because the people in that room didn't know her, but because what she was about to say required the posture of an official, not a guest. She stated her name. She stated her position as a member of the board of Ashford Capital Partners. She indicated that she was convening an emergency board session as authorized under Article 7 of the firm's operating agreement, in response to a co-founder petition that had been filed, received, and reviewed 7 days prior. She noted that a quorum of the board was present. She noted that the vote had been conducted and recorded in advance, in accordance with the operating agreement's provisions for written consent in lieu of meeting. She announced the result. Imani Ashford had been confirmed by a 2/3 board majority as sole operating trustee of Ashford Capital Partners, effective immediately, pending standard legal processing. She sat down. Reginald Osei rose from his seat near the back of the room. He walked to the front. He did not hurry. He handed Jabari a folder, a certified copy of the trust transfer documentation, the board resolution, and the divorce petition, assembled in the order in which they would need to be reviewed by any attorney worth their fee. He said 7 words. "You'll want to have your attorney review these tonight." He returned to his seat. Lawrence Tibbs, the notary, remained where he was. His portion of the work had already been completed before the party began. Jabari stood at the front of the room, holding the folder. The narrator does not invent an expression for his face because the truth is that expressions are insufficient for moments like this one. What was on his face was not rage and not collapse and not the recognizable architecture of a man having a public breakdown. It was something quieter and more permanent. It was the face of a man doing math, recalculating, reviewing a series of decisions he had made across 9 years and arriving, one by one, at the same answer. He had signed everything. He had read nothing carefully. He had trusted correctly and in the wrong direction, attending to the confidence of people who had contributed least, while the person who had built the structure around him worked in quiet and waited. He picked up his jacket. He left the room. The door closed behind him. And for a moment the room held the silence the way a room holds a sound after it has stopped. Not because anyone was afraid to speak, but because there are moments that require their own weight to settle before the world resumes. Celestine sat in the third row. She had not moved. She sat in her best church clothes in a room that had just reorganized itself entirely around her, and for the first time in 11 years, she had absolutely nothing to say. The women beside her did not look at her, not out of cruelty, just because they understood that she was in the process of absorbing something that would take time, and that there was no gesture adequate to that process. The weeks that followed unfolded the way the outline had dictated they would, not in dramatic reversals or confrontations, but in the quiet, administrative language of consequence. Jabari's access to the firm's operational accounts was updated per the trust transfer documentation within 72 hours. His name was removed from the primary operational signature authority. His parking space in the firm's designated lot, a small thing, a trivial thing, had a new nameplate installed by the end of the second week. These were not punishments handed down by a judge. They were administrative acts, clean and impersonal, the kind of things that happen when paperwork is processed correctly. Darnell Page sent Jabari a text message 3 days after the party. It was 3 sentences long. It expressed in professional language his support for Jabari during a difficult time and his intention to give both parties space to process the transition. He did not call. He did not visit. He did not offer anything that required him to remain in proximity to a situation where the infrastructure had fundamentally changed. Men like Darnell understood, with the animal intelligence of the perpetually adjacent, that their value was contingent on access, and access had moved. The 3 anchor accounts remained. Hollingsworth confirmed their continued relationship with the firm within the week. The other 2 followed. One of them requested a brief transition call. Imani took the call on a Tuesday morning, standing in the kitchen in her robe with a cup of coffee in her hand, and handled it in 40 minutes. The account partner told his colleague afterward that she had been the most composed person he had spoken to in recent memory. He was not surprised. He had dealt with her for years. He had simply not been looking. Jabari retained his minority equity stake. The documents had been structured that way, not out of generosity, but out of accuracy. He was a founder. He had contributed to what the firm had become. His stake remained and his distributions continued and his name remained in the founding documents. But he held no operational authority. He made no decisions. He attended no meetings. He existed within the firm the way a signature exists within a contract, present, legible, and no longer capable of changing anything. Celestine's standing in the community did not collapse. That is not what happened. What happened was quieter than collapse and in some ways more lasting. The people who had always deferred to her as the mother of a successful man continued to treat her with care. But the quality of their attention had changed. There was a new precision in how they spoke to her, a new care in what they chose to say in her presence, not cruelty, just accuracy. The community was updating its understanding of the situation, and Celestine was part of the situation being updated. She did not stop going to church. She did not stop running the usher board. But she stopped giving toasts at firm events because there were no more firm events to which she was invited. And she stopped talking about Jabari's company in the present tense because the present tense had moved somewhere she couldn't follow. There was a particular kind of reckoning that Jabari faced in those early weeks that had nothing to do with legal documents or firm access or parking spaces. It was the reckoning that happens in the privacy of a man's own mind when he begins to review, in sequence, the decisions he made across a decade and understand each one for what it actually was rather than what he told himself it was at the time. The moment he brought Darnell in without a formal agreement. The moment he accepted his mother's toast and said nothing. The moment he redirected the Hollingsworth account without a conversation. These were not the actions of a villain. They were the actions of a man who had been given, incrementally and across many years, every signal that a correction was necessary, and who had, each time, chosen the path that required no correction from him at all. A mutual acquaintance saw Jabari at a coffee shop on a Thursday afternoon, about 3 weeks after the party. He was alone at a corner table. He had papers spread out in front of him, legal documents from the look of them. He was reading carefully, with a pen, making notes in the margin. He looked up once and saw the acquaintance, and nodded. He looked, the acquaintance would say later, like a man engaged in the most serious study of his life. Like a man learning a language he should have learned years ago. He looked, the acquaintance said, like he was finally reading something, and the acquaintance, who had known them both since church, and who had attended the birthday party, and who had watched Yvonne Mensah rise from her seat that evening, with the calm authority of someone who had prepared for this moment, felt something in that coffee shop observation that was not quite pity and not quite satisfaction. It was closer to recognition, the recognition of a man who had finally encountered, in full, the cost of his own inattention. On a Saturday morning, 6 weeks after the party, Imani Ashford arrived at the firm's conference room at 8 o'clock. The building was quiet. No staff. The cleaning crew had already been. The chairs were pushed in, and the whiteboard was blank, and the morning light came through the south-facing windows in long, flat lines across the table. She set her bag down. She made tea in the small kitchen off the hallway. She brought the tea to the table, and she sat down with a contract she had been reviewing for a prospective new client, and she worked. There was no performance in this, no symbolic gesture for an audience that wasn't there. She was working because the firm had to be run, and she was the person running it, and there was always work to do. This is what it looks like when a woman who has been patient for a very long time finally has space to simply move at her own pace, in her own direction, with her own name on the door. It doesn't look triumphant. It looks like a Saturday morning and a cup of tea and a contract that needs to be reviewed before Monday. The narrator lingers here a moment, not for drama, but because this is where the truth of the story finally becomes visible in full. Not at the party. Not in the moment the envelope was placed on the table. Not in Yvonne Mensah's announcement or Osei's 7 words. Here, in the quiet of a conference room on a Saturday morning, occupied by a woman who spent 11 years doing the work and waiting for the right moment to claim what the work had always entitled her to. Imani had not entered this marriage looking for a war. She had not drafted those founding documents as a trap or a weapon or a contingency plan against a future she expected to arrive. She had drafted them correctly because she drafted everything correctly. She had structured the equity and the trust and the co-founder designation because that was what the firm's architecture required, and she was the person who built the architecture. She had included the succession clause because she was a contracts attorney who understood that the clauses people skip are the clauses that eventually matter most. She had stayed 11 years. She had sat at Sunday dinners and said nothing when her name was omitted. She had watched the contract redirect happen without sending a single angry email. She had absorbed the drift and the diminishment and the quiet rearrangement of her value within a firm she had helped build, and she had done none of this from weakness. She had done it from a precise understanding of timing, of the difference between the moment you know something and the moment the knowing becomes useful. She had tried to remain. She had tried to trust that the marriage would correct itself. She had extended the benefit of the doubt longer than most would have, because she was not impulsive and she did not enjoy destruction. But there is a version of silence that is patience, and a version that is complicity. And when she sat down in her home office, the night the Hollingsworth redirect landed on her desk, she understood that she had crossed the line between the two without noticing, and that it was time to move. Some people hear stories like this and call it cold. They look at the planning and the timing and the coordination, and they say that a woman who moves with that much precision must have been calculating all along. The narrator will say this only once. There is a difference between a person who plans because they are cold and a person who plans because they have learned through long experience that warmth alone does not protect you. Imani was not cold. She had been warm for 11 years in a house where warmth was taken as evidence that she had nothing else. She had something else. She had simply been waiting for the correct occasion to present it. The narrator closes on her, still at the table, still working, her tea going slightly cool beside the contract. She is not thinking about Jabari. She is not thinking about the party or Celestine or Darnell or any of the architecture of the last 11 years. She is thinking about the new client and what they need and how to build the agreement that will serve them correctly. That is what competence looks like when it is finally fully allowed to face forward. She had not built the firm to take it back. She had built it once, the right way, with the right documents, in the belief that what you construct carefully enough will stand long after the people who doubted you have run out of reasons to keep talking. She had simply let the building speak. And in a room of 47 witnesses, on a Thursday evening in Atlanta, with the board chair on her feet and the notary in the back row and the papers already filed and recorded, it finally had. If you've ever been the quietest person in a room that underestimated you, you already know how this story ends. You've been writing it the whole time. Subscribe if this channel speaks to you. Drop a comment below and tell me, what did Imani do that you're still thinking about? And share this with someone who needs to be reminded that patience in the right hands is not weakness. It is architecture.